All right. Let me start by screen sharing. Cool. I hope because of the technical issue, let's just get into it. So happy Tuesday. Today, we're here to talk about customizing embedded dashboards. Pretty much everything that I'll be showing today will also work in Superset. I'll talk about the differences a little bit later and kind of what we do that's a little bit different, but hopefully this is helpful to everybody. So just a quick overview. So I'll first start with a quick recap on how embedded works. So if you've been to the last, it's mostly going to be a rehash of that, but I'll kind of move through it quickly for people who've already seen it. And it's also good because there's a lot of moving pieces on how the data flows and guest tokens and auth tokens. So it's good to have that kind of in your working memory. And then we can talk about customization options and use cases. So how do you take kind of a dashboard or a template and then create kind of multiple experiences based on who's logged in, basically tailoring the experience to your user. Then I'll kind of talk about two of the main approaches that let us do customization. So one is custom row level security criteria. Another is dashboards as code. And then we'll have Q&A at the end. Cool. So as I mentioned earlier, quick recap on embedded. So how do embedded dashboards work? So this is kind of the same flow, whether you're in Superset or Preset. You create your dashboard in Superset or Preset, and then the way the dashboard works is ultimately it's communicating with the backend. So it's communicating with the Preset backend, and then we at Preset we expose the authentication API, the embedded API as well. And everything here on the left is kind of on the Preset side of things, and here is kind of your app. So you'll notice that you'll need both a backend and a front end. This is crucial. There's no way to kind of do just to safely do just kind of an iframe URL or something that's more standalone feeling. You do need both components. Over time, I'm sure that will be relaxed, that constraint, but in the beginning, it's a great way to ensure security and tight control. And it just makes you feel better about like, hey, are the right users able to access the right data? You can really specify that with the backend by tightening kind of the grip there. And so first, your app needs to authenticate with the Preset API. So you send over an API token and a secret that you get from if API access is available in your account, you'll be able to find it in your UI and get the information and send it over. And then you get back an access token. And then once you have that thing expires every few hours. So you'll want to kind of refresh it often. And then the embedded API works by kind of taking information about the embedded access token, also shown to you via the UI, and all the other relevant information like the dashboard ID, as well as optional row level security clauses. And then the user ID. So we mirror the user ID system that you have. If you have a bunch of users and some unique identifier, you can kind of send that over to us, associate that with the row level security, and then we'll kind of keep track of it for you, essentially. So you don't have to kind of store a bunch of row level security clauses in your database itself. We'll kind of handle that. And then we send back a guest token, which expires about every 5 minutes. So, you probably will want to request in your guest token almost kind of at every request so that you always have a fresh one. Yeah. And then once you have the backend, then you're able to drop in an iframe in your front end code, use the guest token, use the URL that the embedded dashboard lives in, the workspace ID, etc. And then the iframe will kind of pull in safely and securely the embedded experience that you've set up for the customer. And this is kind of a stylized screenshot of what it could look like. And so I glossed over a lot of steps. For people who want to go deeper, I will paste this URL right here so that you can actually read it. All right, I just pasted in the Zoom chat. So this is just a quick overview, right? So this is how you get the preset asset information, the guest token, how do you supply guest tokens, and then how do you embed the actual dashboard. And so basically you have workspaces. This is kind of a key concept to understand in Preset that it doesn't really exist in Superset. Each of these workspaces is kind of, you can think of it like a standalone Superset installation. And then we have our preset manager that's kind of a bridge, that's kind of a role-based access control bridge between all of the workspaces. So you can create teams that have multiple workspaces, that sort of thing. Pretty common in SaaS applications right now. So first you get access to embedded. You can use this URL or just go to preset.io and you'll see it in the top corner as well. So then our sales engineers will meet with you to kind of discuss your use case, design a pricing package, and give you a trial. To enable embedded, as I mentioned earlier, you'll need to get in the UI itself for the dashboard, click embed dashboard, and you get all these tokens. So the embed dashboard ID, the superset, the workspace ID, the team ID. So you'll need to write these down. If you don't write it down the first time, it's not a big deal. You can always do it later. And you can also list your allowed domains. So if you only want your kind of IP address or website to be able to access this dashboard and pull it in, no one else can, then that's an important thing to fill out there. So next is to integrate backend with the preset API. So we've kind of already talked about this. So that's kind of this part of the lifecycle. So the top half, again, is the authentication to the preset API in general. The bottom half is the embedded API. Step 2, integrate app backend with front end. So in your backend, you'll generate a payload with the user information, the resource type. In this case, we only have dashboard support right now. Any IDs of resources you want to grant, so dashboard ID and row level security. You send that to the API, you get back a guest token, and this guest token expires very quickly. And lastly, in your front-end app, you'll want to install the embedded SDK. You can either do the NPM or just do the simple script tag, which just pulls it from unpackage.com. And then you'll basically call the embed dashboard function from the embedded SDK, and then add all the information. So dashboard ID, the domain, the mount point, the guest token function, which just maps to the embedded SDK's function, and then the dashboard UI config. So I'm breezing over this because I already covered it in the last, and we also have a blog post that I wrote that complements this as well. So just a heads up there. And lastly, some best practices, right? You want safeguards at multiple levels. So especially important for embedded dashboards. It's different for internal dashboards where it's not a big deal if dashboards are a little bit slow or if people maybe take a peek at some data that they shouldn't be. It's not kind of maybe deal breaking, but when you're showing data to customers or your users, it's super critical that they can only see the data that they have access to. So row level security is to start. Ideally, you have even more hardening, right? You have a database that has a separate embedded, that has the kind of data powering your embedded dashboards and has very limited access. So, read-only queries, that type of thing. And ideally, you even use a separate workspace so that your internal dashboards and external dashboards are not getting changed automatically. We have a feature actually where you can disable editing in the UI. So if you made a dashboard and you don't want anyone to be able to edit it, you can lock that dashboard or make it so that convert it to such a way that only you can only modify it via the API, for example. So all things that are kind of important when it comes to embedded dashboards. Now we transition to the main star, which is customization options. So what are some of the use cases and what do I mean by customization? So essentially here, we want to take a single dashboard and we essentially want to create multiple products or multiple experiences out of it, right? If you're a gaming company you want your users to be able to log in and see data about their performance and past games, and you might have 1 million users and you don't really want to create 1 million dashboards. Even doing this programmatically via code, it's still a lot of effort to do. And so ideally what you do instead is you create a single dashboard that's generic enough and flexible enough that queries a large set of data. And then you apply row level security clauses or other kind of limitations so that when people are logged in, they only kind of see the data and the charts that is actually relevant to them. So that's kind of a very, very common use case. The gaming example is one that I'm literally kind of inspired by one of our customers. This is exactly what they want to do. It's a little bit different. They actually want to create a separate dashboard for every game. And so I think so if you're a studio, you have a bunch of games, being able to isolate, but without having to create a separate dashboard for each one by hand is super, it's kind of a massive time save. The other kind of customization real world use case we've seen is having the same dashboard, but having the data come from different databases. So this is a situation where you might have one database for staging, for example, and one for production. And so that's an important thing where if we think that embedded dashboards that are facing your customers and your users are products, then it kind of makes sense that you will want to follow kind of some of the software development lifecycle best practices that we've seen in the rest of web development. And so that's an important one. And the last one is to create essentially kind of one template and then spawn multiple dashboards off of that. And so this is a situation where you might just change, it's pretty much the exact same dashboard, but you want to, maybe you'll just apply one kind of limited row level security clause, or if you want to change the theme, right, so people can see different colors and they might see their logo, or you just want to literally just for some people remove specific data sets or charts. So this type of thing is better done through the dashboards as code approach, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. So kind of three main use cases here. I'm sure you guys can think of even more, but the goal here is to kind of convey and teach the core tools and techniques, and then kind of provide, these are basically going to painting brushes to kind of help you be creative, to take kind of a single or just, just a few dashboards and be able to really scale it out. And that's kind of the goal here. So here's kind of a diagram I made that helps kind of set the stage on how to think about customization, and especially when you're thinking about, I have a single dashboard and I want to be able to extend it, right? So understanding the components are key. So on the left, we have this kind of abstract dashboard. It has a few charts. This is kind of a chart container. We can think about it. There's kind of all the context for what's in Explore. What have you chosen, right? Like what fields did you choose? What filters did you put? What legend style did you choose? The color scheme, all these things. You have row level security clauses. So even in your chart itself, you might have some row level security clauses, or it's going to be piped in from your app itself. You have data set logic. So if you have a virtual data set where you're using Jinja templating, this is kind of another fork in your logic that could exist. And then you have filters, right? So people may have chosen something in the dashboard filter itself, and that also mutates the query that's generated. So then we move on to the query. A query is generated based on all the things above. And finally, it hits the database. Pretty straightforward. And then the database returns a bunch of results and rows as well as their types. And then the chart container, now the rendered chart container, essentially has a CSS template and JavaScript code is kind of the two most simple components. The way I think about rendered charts is they don't even necessarily contain data. That's kind of, I kind of think about that as one level lower, just conceptually. But so this is kind of the life cycle for a chart and a query. And then a dashboard, it's kind of just a many-to-many relationship with charts. So a dashboard can have multiple charts, and a chart can be in multiple dashboards as well. So how do we think about row level security? This is kind of one of the most powerful ways of making custom dashboard experiences. So here we have a single dashboard, right? And then we have different clauses. And I've highlighted in purple, I guess this is more of a bluish purple. I've highlighted in bluish purple what aspects of the lifecycle are going to change based on who's logged in. So here we have clauses in the chart container itself that your backend pushes up. We have the query that's generated, and it might affect the where clause, right? And then that affects the rows that are returned. I'll give you a quick example, and then I'll show you a demo of this working. So on the left is a GSW is Golden State Warriors. So I'll be showing off a basketball example. And so here's an example where this is the payload that we generate. So everything else is the same, for these two users. They have the same kind of, the rest of the code is the same. You're authenticating with the preset API. All that's the same. Kind of that top half of the diagram I showed earlier. The bottom half, where you're asking preset embedded API for a specific guest token for the specific user that's logged in, then you can use, in this case, I actually use the same username, but with different clauses. So here, one clause is home team abbreviation equals GSW. So that just means that just tells preset to add a where clause there, right? So row level security is mostly focused on the where part of the SQL that's generated. And so in this case, we only want to show the data for where Golden State Warriors was the home team. In the one on the right, we only want to show this for where the home team was Phoenix. And so you can imagine like one kind of replicating this query, this logic rather, and making it even one level more abstract, where you just take in the current user that's logged in and you replace these kind of one-off declarations here with just a variable one. So based on who's logged in or some other context or the sports team that's shown, you'll just kind of generate a different payload and send that to the preset embedded API. The other option, of course, which I recommend more, is you actually have different user IDs. So in this case, you might have Phoenix as the actual user, and then you'll send this username and first name and last name to the preset API. So then in the future, you actually don't need to send all of this. You can just ask for like just give me the embedded dashboard for GSW manager. You don't have to send all this information necessarily every time. So that's kind of the benefits. If you have an app where you're showing a dashboard in multiple places, this may be kind of a shortcut you may want to use. So what does this actually look like? So this is kind of a dashboard that I built. So if people were here last time, this dashboard is hopefully familiar, except it's expanded a little bit more. There's a few more charts. It's a little bit more organized and tidied up in preparation for this event. So here we now have an NBA stats dashboard. This is kind of just the 2013 season in this. It's the only one that's filtered to a specific year. Here we have team pairings. It's a little bit clustered to see. And one thing you'll notice is when you're creating a single dashboard and you want to show it to multiple people based on who's logged in or some other custom criteria, it's not uncommon to have kind of your main dashboard be a little bit busy or show way too much data or et cetera, because this is kind of the template. And so it's going to be a little too much and potentially not even that useful. However, no one actually sees this dashboard except for you. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind when thinking about building custom embedded dashboards is you're the only one who's going to see this. Everyone else that's logged in is going to see a subset. So each of the charts will be filtered down and contextualized. So just kind of a helpful tip, because when you're building an internal dashboard, it's more likely that the one you see is the same thing that the end user sees, right? In this case, it could be quite different. So here we have a dashboard. We have the most common matchups. So just, home versus away. This is a little bit funny too, because without a specific home team, it's funny just to see the number of times that the Warriors or the Raptors were the away team in this data set of matchups, right? So again, another quirk of building kind of a single dashboard and then filtering it down. Games at home, another quirky kind of chart just by itself to have. It's just like show me all the games and the data related to where a team was at home. But of course, it's not filtered, so the home team's going to have the Bucks, the Suns, the Hawks, and so on. So now let's look at what this actually feels like. So this is the same dashboard, but it's embedded. And so here we have some kind of simple HTML up top, nothing fancy. I'm not an HTML front-end expert, so this is the extent of my abilities. And so here the dashboard, the same dashboard is embedded. However, you'll notice here that I put basketball stats for Golden State Warriors. So that means that this dashboard, the same dashboard as this one, is now filtered to just the data that's relevant to the Warriors. So in this case, because the tab is called Home Games, we want to show data on games where where Golden State Warriors were playing at home. Kind of a specific example, but hopefully it gets the point across, right? So that means in team pairings, we should expect the Warriors to have the largest circle because they are the only consistent kind of team that's in every single matchup in the filter data set, if you think about it, right? So you can see the Warriors, you can see the most common matchup. So which team did the Warriors play the most when they were at home? It turns out it's the Rockets. This is from the 2013 to 2021 season, so not all time, but for 9 years. And so you can see the most common matchup. So Hawks are pretty Rockets and Clippers. It's probably because they're in the same league within the NBA. Trailblazers, Kings, right? And so it's the same information we should expect to see here. So if you see Rockets 26, that lines up with the table. And so essentially to all the queries in these charts, the where home team equals GSW was added. And so it's the same exact dashboard, same charts, except it's just showing less data. So here we have games at home, and now this table is more useful, right? This table was not as useful because it just shows a bunch of matchups. And it's nice to look at raw data, but in this case, we actually get a more filtered view. This is a data set of only the games where Warriors played at home. You'll notice the home team name is only Warriors. So you can see the points that home scored versus the field goal percentage, home versus away, and then 3-point percentage, home versus away, right? So you can imagine the GM of Warriors, a personal friend of mine, I'm just kidding, the GM of Warriors logging in and getting information about their team this way. Here's another example. This is the same app. You'll notice I have localhost 5000 and localhost 5000. In this case, I'm just using a URL scheme, but in reality, you'd probably have completely different logins. And so here we have the same dashboard, except now this is for the Phoenix Suns. So unsurprisingly, you should expect a giant node at the Suns because they're going to be the most common team. They're going to be the team that shows up in every row in this data set. So they're going to have just a massive circle here. And then if you look at the Clippers, it looks like they played the Clippers the most, 20 times. They played the Lakers a bunch as well. The Suns aren't that good of a team anymore, unfortunately, so they just don't have as many matchups as they used to, either at home or away. So, fun fact. And as you expect in the table below, it only has the games where the Suns played at home. So this is kind of the customization in action. You can imagine if you want to do a public embed, you could have a different route for each team, a different route, right? You can have one for the Dallas Mavericks and so on. So being able to do this type of customization is super powerful, and you can do it on anything, right? So if you wanted to create one logged in experience or one custom experience for every season, that's a very simple change. We essentially just need to tweak the dashboard visually so that it makes sense and it's centered around years, and then you just change the row level security clause. So in about an afternoon, you can take this dashboard and transform it to something where you have a dashboard experience for every year that the NBA has played it. Or maybe you want to make it about players, right? Again, spend a few hours, tweak the dashboard to make it a little bit more about players, and then use the RLS or the logged in state to build kind of a custom player dashboard. And so this is really powerful because you can take a core data set and then just in about a day or so kind of create this multi-dashboard experience that normally would be much more painful. You might be kind of writing the whole front end code from scratch, D3 code, you have back end code, you have kind of a lot of moving pieces, and then making those changes might take weeks. In this case, you can kind of turn it around in about a day. And in fact, I updated this dashboard and added these embeds in just 2 hours. So something I did just last week. So, and I'm not an expert by any means. So just to show the power of it, essentially. So another note about row level security is you'll notice that I showed the clauses, but they just applied without, there was no context on the data set, right? The nice thing is you can add more context around the data set. So if you only want row level security to apply to, if you have a dashboard that has like 50 charts in it, a bunch of tabs, many different data sets that it's querying, you'll probably want to get more specific about the clauses. And so you can say, apply home team abbreviation Phoenix, but to this data set, right? This is the data set ID, which you get in the edit data set modal or from the API. So that's kind of a powerful way to limit the RLS that you have. For people who, I linked to the embedded docs earlier, there's more examples in the embedded docs. I recommend reading it. So there's information about what's required, right? User, the resources, and RLS. And then you can choose optional dataset IDs. You can choose all the clause. You can have multiple rules and then they're joined using the AND clause, or you can do a string literal and it'll be or. You can also use Jinja templating. So that's kind of another level of kind of dynamic painting brush that you have. So, and the one thing here is be very careful about the type of things you put in. You don't want untrusted input here. That's how you get a SQL injection in text. So just be very careful about, this is kind of you're dynamically modifying the querying on your own. So just be careful. The next part of this is dashboards as code. So we've kind of done an event on this, but we've never talked about this in relation to embedded. So that's kind of what I'm here to do for the rest of this demo. So essentially, the way dashboards as code works is all the assets in a superset or preset are essentially just objects in a database, and they have a schema, and those can be represented as kind of flat files, essentially. It's not how superset or preset natively stores these. It's not like a data lake or something. It's more that you can kind of create almost like kind of digital asset twins that mirror what's in the database and then use those to resolve and update the state of the database. That's kind of how I would think about it. So it's similar to having like lots of data sets as CSV files or something, and then you're maybe synchronizing them to your database for a specific reason. So that's how I would think about it. The nice thing here is you are benefiting from version controls. All of the dashboards, databases, charts, and then data sets, all of these assets you're able to pull out from preset, but also make them more dynamic. So that's a super powerful way to take a work that you've already done, right? So you've already built a single dashboard, and then you want to pull out the relevant metadata, and then enhance it and embellish it, and then push it back into kind of this real world setting. And so you can kind of build this is a very kind of simple pipeline to think of. And so one of the most powerful ways of using dashboards as code when it comes to embedded is to separate discovery from delivery. So for people that live in product, it's basically that verbiage just means that you have the first phase where you're exploring a lot of options, you're prototyping, you're getting feedback, that type of thing. And then it's really about learning what to build, and delivery is, all right, we know what to build. How do we get it out there safely and reliably and kind of add value to our users or our customers, right? So kind of separating two phases. The first is about learning. The second is about actually building. And so in this situation, it's very natural to separation. So you might have this entire workflow that I showed earlier, but just using the staging database, right? With the staging database, it's probably way more forgiving. You may have a lot of access to it. You're probably open to random analysts on your team, just loading in CSV files and quickly building dashboard prototypes, right? So the goal here is just to try things as quickly as possible and kind of slowly converge to the right solution. And when you're in the delivery phase, you want to harden it. You want to deploy it to a different database, probably, which we strongly recommend, or at least a different schema, or the same database with a different role at a minimum. So again, you want that hardening and separation wherever you can. So the delivery phase, when you're doing this for real, you'll want to create a separate database. Ideally, you have kind of more guardrails around it, higher performance guarantees, because you don't want your users to wait 3 seconds for a dashboard to load. They're kind of used to sub-second. And so this is a really important thing that you can do with dashboards as code. I won't show the whole workflow today because we've done kind of at least 2 events on it and a lot of blog posts, but I just kind of want to convey how these 2 things intersect. So in this post that Beto wrote, one of our awesome engineers, he talks about crafting custom assets, custom Superset assets, right? So how can you take the assets that you've already created in or Superset and then modify them with some extra logic? So in this case, we have an example from the post where we take the database YAML file. You'll notice that there's a SQL Alchemy URIs. This is kind of the full information essentially that's needed to connect to that database. It's a URI string, and this actually supports Jinja templating. And so it's not the same Jinja templating as the one in the preset or Superset. It's a different one. This is more, so Jinja originally came from Python. So this is kind of more the original Python one where you add some if-then statements, versus the Jinja in preset is more about, creating dynamic query paths. So here we have a if-then, or sorry, an if-else statements that show, okay, if this database is being used in this region or this workspace 1, then use this URI. And if it's instead in this other workspace, use a separate URI. So as I mentioned earlier, we do recommend having different workspaces, as one for your internal or testing one and one for your external embedded customer-facing set of dashboards. So if you're gonna, this is kind of how you can essentially do that, right? Where you can go in, you can pull out the databases that are already there, and then assign one to your staging and then one to your production. And so being able to do this in code is a powerful thing. And this is kind of the full post I mentioned earlier, creating custom assets in Superset programmatically using preset. And so here's some kind of use cases that fit into embedded when it comes to building these experiences. So one, a custom logo and Markdown component. So this is mentioned in the blog post. Some of you may know that you can add a Markdown chart that uses a iframe in the Mark to pull in and reference a third-party image. So if you have an image, let's say you have the Golden State Warriors logo on the internet, or just in S3 in your file system, and you want to create a dashboard where there's kind of that logo in every single dashboard based on who's logged in. Currently in the Markdown chart, there's no way to do if this user's logged in, show this image or this logo. If this user's logged in, show another logo. What you instead need to do is kind of create these separate experiences where essentially you kind of create one dashboard with a single logo. You use the API then to kind of manually replace. You maintain a list of all the teams and their logos and the file locations, and then you can hot swap the image URL that's there so that everyone that logs in sees a different image. You can replace text. So let's say, and this is a situation where you actually take a dashboard template and then you kind of copy and paste the YAML for every team. Eventually you reach a scale where you want each team or user that's logged in to have a more custom experience than just row level security. When you're on that path, the only way to do that sustainably and scalably is with assets as code. This approach means that you can build a single dashboard, use source control and code to talk to each dashboard and replace values. So if you want the person who works at Golden State Warriors to really feel valued and that they're having a custom experience, you'll want to replace the logos. You'll also want to replace chart titles and the labels as well, right? So all of this is accessible via the YAML that's generated in this dashboards as code approach. You may want to tweak the queries. So if you have, based on the workspace a dashboard is in, you may have more or less row-level security clauses, right? You can imagine working with the customer where they're only the manager looks at the data, And so then you don't need that much data security maybe because you're just showing them their data. But then if you also have all the individual players or all the individual salespeople also log in for that organization, then you may want more kind of guardrails just for that kind of organization, right? So you can kind of tweak these queries based on who's logged in, which is nice, and the dash and using the API for this. Lastly, you may want to carefully modify explore options, right? So you may want to change the color scheme for a chart that's only in a single dashboard, for example. So because all of the kind of core information about datasets, dashboards, charts, and databases are exposed as YAML files through the API, you can kind of do whatever change that you want to make. The last thing I want to talk about is what the difference is between Superset and Preset Embedded. The main difference by far is the workspace. So you can just hit a button and then you get a workspace. So here we have our customer embeds. These are separated from the NASA workspace here and the Mark Watney rescue mission workspace. So super important that we separate those, right? We don't want those tangled up. And so in the embeds one, this is the one that you have to wear gloves when you're editing things in here. There's a few other things as well. Like we ship, every 2 weeks, we take the latest and greatest of Superset Master and we ship it to Preset. We test it, we QA it. So if there's a bug or a feature you see in Bleeding Edge Master and you're wondering when it's going to make it to release, official releases take a few months, but we automatically put things in every 2 weeks. And lastly, you get the usual benefits of a vendor. So training, if you need help getting set up here, support and feature prioritization. So if there's something you want prioritized, we might be able to do that. You get compliance benefits, right? So with Embedded, it's super important to make sure that only the right people can query data. And even on our end, that you're working with us and you trust Preset to manage not your data, but just access to the data. And lastly, there's public cloud or private cloud options. So yeah, that is pretty much it. I'll take questions now. All right, let's look at Q&A. Vinicius asks, is there a way to embed filters for the final user to use with filter box deprecated or the filter at the left of the dashboard? That's a great question. You absolutely can. I actually just hit it. So let me see if I can quickly get that working. So if I edit this dashboard and then what did I do? I think I edited properties. You can go to advanced here. I clicked show native filters. I set that to false just so it takes up less space in the viewport. Then I hit save and I save it here. All right, now we have the filter, we have seasons. So let's actually refresh this. And now we have filters. So this should be exactly, hopefully what you're looking for, right? So yeah, there's no more filter box. So it is still there, to be clear, but it is being deprecated. So we don't recommend using it. And dashboard filters just are way more high performance as well. And also to the user, it is a little bit quirky to have a chart type as filters, right? And so being able to have it live one level higher in the dashboard layer is, and so you can edit these, you can add more, right? Let's say we add one right here, filter, we add the same data set, value, we pick instead the away team abbreviation, let's say, right? We hit save, name is required, of course. We gotta put a name for our filter, and we hit save. All right, now it's updating, and now the away team is there. This is the loading here as it's computing all of the unique values in the away team. A fun fact, this data set lives in Google Sheets, so that's why queries can be a little slow sometimes. There we go, so we see all the away teams here, some favorites here, I am sure, and now it's saved, so we can refresh it. And now we see two. So any filter that you see, you can add it and then it'll be exposed. I just chose to hit it for the demo. All right, are these slides going to be shared at the presentation? I'm happy to make them public and share them. And so when the email goes out, we can share that as well. Dennis asks, is it possible to customize the look and feel? Yeah, absolutely. You essentially just need to use CSS templates. So if you go to our docs, actually, we have a lot of great, I'm not a CSS template expert, but we should have a section, loads the CSS editor. So this is our awesome documentation. Yeah, essentially what it boils down to is you need to, so you can absolutely edit it. And the way you do it is you go here and then you click edit CSS, and then you can load from our, pre-existing ones. So this is kind of a New York Times-esque template is the name of it apparently. So we click save, and then it has that Times New Roman font. then you refresh it, and each time it uses the iframe, and what do you know? We have this New York Times thing. So in just one click, I'm pretty sure that one of my coworkers, Will Pringle, made this awesome template. But so the dashboard looks completely different now, right? All I did was change the CSS template. So the CSS template you can absolutely do, and then you can also change it. You can access it through the API as well. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. The hardest part, I will be honest, is understanding the existing HTML that's here. You basically just need to use your browser inspect mode and kind of look at, what do you want to change? Do you want to change the gray space between the charts, right? You might want to click there and then click inspect, and you can see, okay, so this is the class I need to override, ant tabs nav wrap. So in your CSS, you need to. So whatever you want to change the CSS for, use inspect, use your browser inspect and debug mode to figure out the CSS class that you need to kind of manually style. All right, next question. Darun asked, not related to embedded, is there any way the users are registered automatically without login or updated in Superset when we have added the user email to the OAuth group? I gotta say, I'm not an expert with the OAuth side of things. Neither I am with Azure as well. I will say, I can speak generally about this for both preset and Superset. When you're doing embedded, there's no such thing as a user. Really, there's the user IDs in your system, but everyone who sees a dashboard, you're kind of in your own user space. It's whatever user management system you want to use. And so if you want to bridge those, then that's kind of a separate thing. If you're not talking about embedded, then you're just talking generally. I believe right now the only way you can register users without logging in, you can use if you're in Superset, you can use the Superset CLI for that. So Superset is based on Fab, Flask App Builder. So I would go learn about kind of Superset Fab and the relationship between those projects, because a lot of the user management, the CRUD aspects of the user management is actually done using the CLI, which just wraps all the routes available in Flask App Builder. So I think it might be possible, but unfortunately, I'm not an expert on that. Dennis, for example, could we change the CSS directly or move the various components around? Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, that's what I did here. Right. I mean, moving components around, I'm not sure what you mean by that. That's kind of trickier. Ideally, you're using the best way is by far to use the UI to make these type of changes. Editing this type of thing, the underlying HTML and JavaScript, you cannot permanently style. So CSS styling is only for kind of the last mile extra CSS styling. So after the browser and the Superset code base has already done all the painting and styling, then you can come in and then add your own CSS styles to overwrite what was already generated. There isn't really a way to change the process and the pipeline that's generating the first assets visually. You're basically kind of adding on, overriding what was already generated. So that's the important thing. So yeah, if you change this live, it will immediately render. So you can make a change, close the box, see the change, and then iterate from there. So it's immediate. She asks, what can we do with large text on graphs? Legends can cross with the graph. I mean, it's not really an embedded question. If you have large text and legends that are crossing with the graph, you have two options. One is you can rename the items in your legend so that they're shorter. So if you have, by default, the way your data is stored and named in your database may not be ideal for putting on a legend, right? So you may want to rename them. So you can use this is actually a great use case for the Superset semantic layer. You can just take a column, write some quick logic this would be a calculated column. So you can use like a case statement or something and rename all these kind of long text values in your legend with short ones. So that's one way. Another way is just to increase the chart container. So if you give your charts more room to breathe and render, then legends will look nicer as well. You can also use padding too. So a combination of these techniques should get you there. But this is a no-code tool and a BI tool. So I will emphasize that this isn't kind of if you want a high degree of control over exactly the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's I'll be honest, this may not be the best tool for you. The other options, you could build custom-based plugins and get more control that way. But in general, the goal is to get like 80% there with a no-code interface. There's a trade-off. Just fundamentally, there's design trade-off there where you lose a little bit of control, but you get a more pleasant UI. Marlon asks, is there a way to handle large string values, like really long names. I'm not sure what you mean exactly by that. So Superset and Preset just query your database. So if your database supports it, it should be fine. And then Superset and Preset just store it in its own database. As long as database happy, then those tools are happy. Now, visually, long string values probably just don't look good. And so part of this too is like, is this a design problem or an engineering problem, right? Because in some cases, if you have a string with, 1 million letters, do you want to show that to your end user? Because they will not be able to understand and parse mentally 1 million values. So I think that's a challenge. And so I would say in general, whatever, as long as it visually looks okay, Superset and Preset can usually handle it. Just there may be some truncation and stuff like that. But as I mentioned, use the techniques I talked about earlier to kind of get around them. Otherwise, just think about recasting them to being much shorter. Third one has a follow-up question. Does the embedded dashboard work well with Android and iOS apps? Do we need anything we need to take care of while using embed dashboard? The main thing, you can use them in Android and iOS. It works okay. The main thing is, you'll need to write, the embedded SDK is currently a JavaScript SDK. And so you need to kind of build your own Android and iOS framework if you want a native experience. But keep in mind that, Superset and Preset, they're going to show you HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it will not be an Android Java chart or an iOS Swift chart. That won't really work. So what you instead need to do is build an app that's essentially just a viewport. That's like a web view. And then it has a little bit of JavaScript and it's just rendering the dashboard. So just keep that in mind. It won't be native, right? So they won't be native charts and dashboards. You're dropping in a web view and then pulling in charts and dashboards from Superset or Preset. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. So there's nothing about that that's specific to mobile, right? Because it's all on the web, you can put on a TV if you want to. It doesn't really matter. As long as there's support for pulling in a web components and for using browsers. That's the key thing. Xiaoxi asks, not related to embedding, is it possible to download a pivot table as a CS file? If you've tried that in Superset, it's showing the underlying table without the pivot table. It may not be possible. I'm not an expert with all the ways you can download the CSV file. Superset's a big tool. I imagine that if you download the pivot table and it only showed the underlying data, that is probably the way it was designed to be used. It's a little bit tricky if you think about it because pivot tables, they are a table, but they're also not very CSV friendly because they don't have a strict row and column structure. They're not tidy data sets, right? So that makes CSV generation a little bit messier to do. It's definitely doable, and likely you'll just need to kind of, either you can implement it yourself and submit a PR because it's a pretty small thing. But honestly, there are some people who prefer the raw data and some people prefer the pivoted data. So it's actually a good thing to bring up in a discussion. So we have a Superset community town hall, I believe, in 2 days. So if you want to bring it up there, that could be a good thing to do, or just open an issue and start a conversation and then link to that issue thread in Slack as well. You can use the contributing channel if you'd like. But yeah, this is an interesting thing. This is an area where what you want is actually maybe in conflict with what other people want. So this is the type of design decision that probably needs a little bit more debate. So it's probably not possible right now. All right, so you have a few minutes left. Happy to take a few more questions about embedded, or we can call it a wrap. Going once. Awesome. Well, I don't think there's any more questions. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for your time. I hope everyone got value out of this. I'm happy to share the slides if you're interested. I will also link, so for people who haven't been to our last event, that was a full hour just on embedded. Highly recommend watching it because it's, that's where I go deeper into like what is, like if you're looking at this and you're like, what, I don't know what the heck a guest token is, go watch that event that I did and you'll learn a lot more there. I'll also link to this blog post, which talks about the dashboards as code approach to customizing assets that you've created. So great. Thanks again for coming and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.